Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And whenever we look back at old TV shows, movies, books, and music, there's this common refrain about how some of it could never be made today. And in certain cases, that criticism is entirely valid. Like it or not, some types of media just don't age very well. The premise, the plot, the personalities, and the circumstances, they just don't work anymore. Now that's not to say they're bad, but let's not lie to ourselves. If a show like All in the Family came out today, it would not have the same impact. But for certain shows and movies, I think that criticism is misplaced and misapplied. And one such show is Married with Children, a beloved sitcom from the late 80s and early 90s that redefined what a sitcom could be. This show, with its insanely dysfunctional family in the Bundys, often gets lumped in with shows that could never be made today. Between its crude brand of humor, its misanthropic overtones, and its reckless disregard for traditional sitcom tropes, it's just hard to imagine it succeeding in the current cultural climate. But, as someone who regularly watched the show while it was still on the air, and regularly rewatched it to this day, I would respectfully disagree with that notion. I'll even go so far as to say that Married with Children, both the show and its overarching themes, are just as relevant today as they were when the show came out. Now yes, this show is still a product of its time. And yes, there are certain plots, tropes, and characterizations that just wouldn't work outside that particular time and setting. But, if you take a step back and look at the bigger picture, Married with Children does have a message that's worth heeding. And there are even greater lessons to be learned, some of which we still haven't grasped since the show went off the air. Now, to understand that message, it's also important to understand the origins and circumstances of this show. Because unless you're over a certain age, you probably don't realize just how groundbreaking Married with Children was for its time. In the early to mid 1980s, most sitcoms followed a similar formula. There were these feel-good, slice-of-life type shows that tried to paint a rosy picture of the American family. Shows like The Wonder Years, The Cosby Show, The Facts of Life, and Who's the Boss gave audiences these fun, likable characters that we could grow and relate to. Yes, they had their flaws and antics, but they always seemed to resolve their problems in a sweet, heartwarming way, all while making room for commercials and product placements. But Married with Children aspired to be precisely not that. In fact, the original working title for the show when it was being developed was not The Cosbys. But in many respects, this show had to be different. It was set to premiere on the Fox network, which was a new, unproven broadcasting network at the time. Both the show and the network faced a lot of uphill battles, so in order to succeed, Fox needed a show that would stand out. And Married with Children would definitely stand out. Now, I won't go into the lengthy story about the inspiration for the show, but I'll include in the description a link to a video that goes into that in greater detail. But what's relevant here is that the show's creator, Michael Moy and Ron Levitt, sought to present a family sitcom devoid of the rosy idealism of the time. They saw those other shows as wholly unrealistic, completely ignoring the ugly, painful realities that most families faced. Whereas watching those other sitcoms would make an audience feel bad for not being that functional, watching Married with Children would make them feel good for not being so dysfunctional. It was a complete inversion of the standard sitcom formula. And at the time, it probably seemed too crazy to work. But it did. Married with Children didn't just find an audience. It became an unprecedented success. To date, it is one of the most successful TV shows of all time. It still holds the record of being Fox's longest-running live-action sitcom. And a big part of that success goes beyond the crude comedy and the cartoonish antics of the Bundy family. Because on the surface, the Bundys are structured like many other sitcom families. You've got a husband and a wife with 2 kids and a dog. They all live in a suburban neighborhood just outside of a major city, in this case Chicago. The husband works while the wife stays at home with the kids. But that structure is the only thing the Bundys have in common with other families. Everything else about them is one big, spectacular mess. Al Bundy, is not a proud family man, and he is not living the American dream. He was once a star football player in high school, and he had everything going for him. Then he hooked up with Peggy, she got pregnant, and his life just went downhill from there. But at the same time, Peggy Bundy isn't living the dream either. As a mother and a wife, she never strives to do beyond the bare minimum. She doesn't cook, she doesn't clean, she doesn't give thoughtful motherly advice of any kind. Her whole life revolves around sitting on the couch, watching daytime TV, and eating bonbons. And when she's not nagging Al for sex or ignoring her kids, she's planning her next shopping trip. Also like Al, Peg was hot stuff in high school, the girl all the guys wanted to hook up with. But when she got knocked up and married, she basically settled for Al. She no doubt believes that she could have done better, but these were just the cards she got dealt. As for their kids, Bud and Kelly, well, they don't do much to temper this dysfunction. Kelly Bundy is a trashy, irresponsible, thick-headed blonde bimbo who only ever attracts the worst kind of men. And Bud Bundy is a devious, scheming, self-centered pervert who only ever strives to hook up with desperate women. And on top of all that, they're not the kind of siblings who support and confide in one another. Hell, for much of the show, Bud and Kelly are constantly at each other's throats, insulting, undermining, and plotting against one another at every turn. It certainly makes for some fun, ridiculous situations, but it also reflects what might be the most defining trait of the Bundy family. These people, with all their snark and deficiencies, are often their own worst antagonists. Everything they do throughout the course of the show, and everything that guides their various antics and outlooks, much of it is a byproduct of their many personal flaws. Now, not all those flaws are their fault, but even with the ones that are, they just don't have the motivation or self-awareness to do anything about it. This is their world. This miserable, low-class, low-brow life, it's just who they are. And they're very much resigned to that fate. In essence, Married with Children isn't about how these characters rise above these limitations. It's about how they navigate this miserable existence. And their approach, as flawed and as ineffective as it might be, often makes for some hilarious television. Watching Al, Peg, Bud, and Kelly live their unenviable lives, annoying one another, berating one another, and failing at every turn, it's a beautiful display of never-ending disaster porn. They take being a dysfunctional family to such absurd extremes. And there's really no endgame to it all. Just like there's no endgame to those stuck in never-ending cycles of failure and misery. It's only ever about just getting by. And it's here where I think Married with Children has something to offer besides the comedy. Because while the Bundy family might be dysfunctional to an extreme, they also live in a world that doesn't do much to mitigate it. Society just isn't good to them, and never has been. Neighbors, bosses, co-workers, and pretty much everyone who ever crosses paths with the Bundys, they look down on them. They see them as these dumb, lower-class trash, and they treat them as such. And the Bundys are more than happy to return the favor. Now, to some extent, that's a necessary contrivance of the show. The world of Married with Children reinforces the Bundys' dysfunction at every turn, thereby keeping them within this miserable dynamic. But it's a contrivance that can and does manifest outside the world of sitcoms. Real people and real families do get caught up in similar cycles. And most of us probably know someone who has experienced it. For one reason or another, they find themselves in these miserable, low-class, hopeless situations. Be it a loveless marriage, a bad job, or a messy home life. I personally know people who have been in that predicament. Married with Children was off the air by the time I went to college. But even after that, I did come across some people who fell into similar traps as the Bundys. I actually knew this one girl in high school who had so much promise in her field. But after she graduated, she ended up marrying a guy she thought would support her. But she ended up being dead wrong. She and her husband were not on the same page after they got married, and they just got into this rut that they never truly escaped. I don't know if they ever got divorced, but they definitely seemed defeated after a certain point. As I got older, I encountered many others who fell into that same sense of defeatism. I don't think anyone ever ended up as bad as the Bundys, but they did fall into a similar trap. And that trap was very hard to get out of. Those that did had to overcome a lot. But those that didn't, well, their stories rarely got told. And they certainly wouldn't have made for a good sitcom. Because for those stuck in those traps, as well as those who escaped them, Married with Children really did resonate. It shined a light on this less wholesome type of family dynamic. And even though it took things to cartoonish absurdities, the Bundy family still felt more real compared to other sitcom families. They lived lives of such misery, poverty, and self-deprecating dynamics. And for a lot of families, regardless of the time period, that's more honest and genuine in the grand scheme of things. The comedy helped make it palpable, but it didn't make the larger themes any less relevant. That's why I believe that if Married with Children were still made today, it would still find an audience. Even if you update the settings, I think it would still work. And in some respects, it might work even better. You see, in the late 80s and early 90s, things were already declining for the middle and lower classes. Everyone seemed to be working harder for longer. Their wages weren't going up, their opportunities were becoming increasingly limited, and our ability to connect with one another was becoming a lot harder, even before the advent of social media. Al Bundy today could never support his family as a shoe salesman. In fact, he'd probably have to be among those who had to do multiple side gigs just to pay his mortgage. Peggy Bundy's deep aversion to work wouldn't help, although she would still resonate with audiences who have become disillusioned with work. As for Bud and Kelly, well, I can honestly see Bud falling into the incel community. I can also see Kelly trying to make it as an Instagram model. And both would end up failing spectacularly and hilariously along the way. The times may change, standards and tastes may change, but the people who get cast aside by society, the people who live, work, and struggle on the lower rungs of the class hierarchy, those issues are still relevant. And there's certainly dysfunction to be had in those issues, including some ripe for comedy. That is why Married with Children still matters. And that's why plenty of others can still relate to the Bundy family and their never-ending struggles. This show dared to highlight the uglier side of the American dream. It made the case that getting married, having kids, and working a steady job is not the end-all be-all of a successful life. For some, it's not a goal. It's the end. It's the purgatory. It's the perennial penalty box for bad choices, bad circumstances, and unexceptional abilities. It can get really ugly and bleak. But if there's one silver lining to it all, one message of hope that Married with Children offered to audiences, present and future, it's this. Your family might be a mess. Your life might be miserable. Your circumstances might suck on every level. But at least you're not the Bundys. Thanks for watching, everyone. And thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.